to the court this evening. Thank you for making it in on what has been a very wet, cold day. It's much appreciated. Lovely to see such a rich audience with us tonight. My name is Caroline Levitt. I'm really delighted to be here just to celebrate this wonderful publication. It's beautiful. Here it is on the front here. And this glorious, rich purple, and it's got embossed cards on the front and everything. It's lovely. You have to touch it afterwards. It's very tactile. And do buy one, because the book is being sold over drinks after we have launched it properly. It's a book that has been, as I understand it, several years in gestation. It came out of a call for contributions in 2019, I think. Is that right? So it's been a while. Is that right? Yeah, something like that. So it's been a few years, which means that all of the contributions are really well thought through and just really exciting and rigorous, and contribute so much to a field that I think has really grown in the last few years. The topic of surrealism and magic, or magic more generally even, but certainly surrealism and magic, has really come to the fore, I think, in the last decade or so. And we've seen exhibitions about surrealism and magic. I'm thinking about the Peggy Guggenheim in Venice a couple of years ago. Publications from amongst tonight's speakers as well that deal with that as a theme. So the tarot as a particular focus is a really exciting thing to be looking at. And this book does it in a really fascinating way that has a wonderful balance between tradition and innovation and modernity and play, but also a really serious understanding of the background of the tarot and what that means for surrealism. So I really encourage you to read it, and I know that our speakers in a moment will tell you more than that. But it's a really kind of multi-vocal publication. It's got 18 contributors in total, which seems like a huge achievement in its own right. So well done, congratulations on that. And congratulations on giving us a contribution to a growing field and something that I know is going to shape that field and that will be of relevance to us here, many of our students on MA programs here, and I know that's where a lot of people have come from, as well as kind of old friends of surrealism. I can see some very familiar faces in the audience. So thank you very much for being here, and I hope that you will use this book and find it helpful to your own studies, whether those are in surrealism and 20th century art, or whether they are in print culture or medieval art. I think this sort of stretches in terms of the ways that we can use this work and understand it together. So thank you. I'm looking forward to a really exciting discussion in due course, because I know that we do have a very rich and interesting and varied audience. So get your questions ready as you're listening to the papers from the four speakers. And what we're going to do now is I will introduce our speakers, and then we're going to move to a short intervention from each of them, 10 to 15 minutes, where they will talk about a particular aspect of the book. And then we will have all of the speakers at the front for a discussion and open up to questions from you. And then we will move to drinks and a chance to purchase the book in the research forum just that way afterwards. So without further ado, let me introduce our speakers. The first of whom is Dr. Tessa Baudouin, who is a historian of art and culture, and she also edited the volume. She teaches heritage studies at the University of Amsterdam, and she researches surrealism, avant-garde collections, and curiosity cabinets. Secondly, we have Dr. Felicity G, who is Associate Professor of Modernist Literatures and Avant-garde Studies at the University of Exeter. Her research has explored surrealism, world literatures, affect theory, women writers, feminist and queer activism, and issues of social justice and mental health, which is a lot. Robert Shehu-Ansel is a publisher and independent scholar, and his company, Fulgur Press, specialises in esoteric art and artists of the 20th century, and they are the publishers of this volume. And finally, last but not least, Dr. Will Atkin is an art historian whose research is focused on the history of the surrealist. He's a teaching fellow at the Courtauld, where he lectures on 19th and 20th century European art history, and will be known to many of you in the audience. Between tonight's speakers, they are responsible for the related books Surrealism and the Occult, 2014, Surrealist Sorcery, 2023, Contributions to Surrealism, Occultism and Politics, 2018, and Surrealist Women's Writing, A Critical Exploration, 2020, and also editing the first English translation of André Breton's Magic Art, 2024, which is no small feat. So I will leave you in their capable hands and hand over to Tessa at this point. Thank you very much.
Hello, everyone. Welcome. I'm so happy to be here. I'm so happy that this event is finally here. I would like to start by expressing my thanks to the colleagues here at the portal. Caroline, thank you. Especially Will Atkin for making this event possible. And I also want to say many thanks to Robert Shehu Ansel. It's thanks to your vision and your hard work and your persistence that this book is now finally here. And I really appreciate it. So I have a few things that I want to say, and usually I go over time, so I have my little timekeeper here, so I'll try and stick to 11 minutes. The many wonderful contributions in this book, they focus on the different ways that the surrealists encountered, engaged with, celebrated, practiced, and designed tarot cards. And if I paint with a very broad brush, I can say that, well, at least in my view, surrealist tarot practice adapts and develops in a parallel way to, let's say, the way that the role and function of tarot in society changes over the 20th century. So in first instance, it's positioned as a divination device, as a fortune-telling tool, but later, in parallel to the reinvention of tarot culture of the 1960s, in Surrealism too, the cards come to be seen much more subjectively, as tools for personal transformation. And in between, I would say there's a period that they really act like oracle cards. What remains constant is the surrealist recourse to tarot cards in exploring the imagination and integration of different realities. Now, the surrealist attitude towards tarot appears paradoxical because it is taken seriously but also not. So this is the full photograph that you just saw. Photographed by André Cartes, a fellow traveler of surrealism, and it's known as the fortune teller. You see here the glass bowl, for instance, the grand étallat and the petit étallat tarot cards. And I think this paradoxical photograph just captures it precisely. It's serious and grave, but it's also very, very staged. And it also gives us clear indications that we should be careful with what we think we see, because the two objects in the middle are both instances of distorted vision, a glass bowl and a loupe as well. Now, useful here, I would say, is the concept of objective cartomancy, introduced by card historian Brunel Bouchet, who is here in the audience, 2024. Cartomancy means, of course, divination with cards. The added modifier objective makes the concept function similarly to the key surrealist notion of hasard objectif, or objective chance. So we have objective cartomancy. How do you practice objective cartomancy? I would say what the surrealists do is they use the cards and their symbolic system not so much for prediction as such, but rather as a poetic and philosophical tool to connect disparate realities and to imagine new possibilities. And to imagining new and other possibilities, it brings me to 4 major arcana cards designed by Roberto Matta, surrealist artist, in 1944. And they accompany the book L'Arcane by André Breton. They're not illustrations, but they are brought out at the same time as companion works. It's 4 cards: the Lovers, the Chariot, the Stars, and the Moon as well. And I would like to propose a reading of one card as imagining a particular possibility, a particular future. Now, as those of you familiar with surrealism will know, Arcane is about the love of André Breton for Elisa Bind of Ennet, of whom he would become the second husband. And she is identified with the star. And the book overall is about the power of woman, of female powers to save men and mankind, with card 18 standing for feminine powers. And Breton is saved through love, so that is the Lovers. But then the card that Matta adds is the Chariot, which we see here. So remember that this is 1944. And the Chariot is a card about strife, and it's a card about conflict. But it's also about overcoming strife. It's a card about victory, of triumph, especially also spiritual triumph. So I think this is a card that at that time works towards a particular kind of future that Matta hoped for. The card clearly responds to existing iconographical schemes, and I've included two examples from the French tarot tradition. And I would like to highlight two particular interventions that Mata has done. And the first one is that the figure, so the triumphal figure, they have a Star of David on their chest. And we can read it as a cultural symbol, we can read it as a magical symbol, but in the context of the time, I think we can also really read it as a symbol of the Jewish people, and in that sense, a political intervention. The second intervention is also that usually the chariot is square, but here the chariot, or Mata's chariot, is triangular. So it's not so much about stability, but it's much more about dynamism and transformation. Now we're staying in the wartime period, but just a couple of years earlier, in 1940-41, the surrealists, or a group of surrealists, designed more cards. And I'd like to talk about these cards a little bit in the context of using cards to offer hope and an alternative future. So as is well known, during 1940-41, so in the winter, several surrealists and fellow travelers were staying in the south of France, which was not yet occupied, waiting for a visa to get out of the country. They stayed at a villa called Villa Herbel, and to pass the time they played lots of games, and they also designed cards, playing cards, and you see them here, known as the Jeux de Marseille. They were never produced at the time. Breton tried, but it never materialized. So what we see here is the cards that were eventually produced in 1983. So this is not a tarot set, and please forgive me for undermining sort of the premise of this evening to talk about tarot and actually bringing playing cards, because that is in a sense what they are. But of course the surrealists couldn't maintain the ancien regime. So king, queen, and jack have been replaced by new court cards, the genius, the siren, and the mage. And there is this as well. And the four colors are fundamental surrealist tenets. Love, a red flame; the dream, a black star; revolution, a bloody wheel; and knowledge, a black lock or keyhole. And we see here three original designs by Lambert, Alice from Alice in Wonderland by Lam, and Pancho Villa by Max Ernst. And I think you also sort of see the difference between the originals and sort of the way that they've been homogenized for the final edition. There is also a joker. Before we go to the joker, one more thing that I want to say about the four colors. I think if these cards had been produced at that time in the war period, and people would have been able to play with these cards, they could have served as beacons of hope in really dark times, because with the four colors of revolution and dream and love, they really point towards surrealist essentials as a way out, but also a way forward, at least in the imagination, if not in reality, in a dark period. But let me move on to the joker. The joker is Ubu. And Ubu, the design, is directly based on a woodcut that Alfred Jarry made, who is the author of a play about this figure, Père Ubu, which came out in 1896. It was a complete scandal on the first night. If you haven't read it yet, read it. It's totally weird and childish. And Père Ubu, the character, is totally weird and childish. He's very vulgar, he's greedy, he's a bully, he's conceited, he's self-aggrandizing. Ubu is a dick, sorry, but he really is. And that's the point of him. He seems stupid, but he's actually quite cunning. And also, Ubu is in a position of power. So in the play, he becomes king of Poland, and he shows himself to be a despot. And a tyrant even. And I think, not to make it too political, but I think actually we live in a time of Ubus. I think we have Ubu in the White House. I think we have Ubus in Europe and also in the politics of my own country, and I find it very, very worrisome. And I read Ubu within the context of the surrealist show as a warning. Yes, he is a joker. Yes, he is laughable. Yes, he is despicable. And of course, laughing at power is one of the methods in the surrealist arsenal. And I think it's clearly one thing that the surrealists intended by including Ubu, Père Ubu, as a joker. And this is a time of men, when they made this card, it's a time of men like Mussolini and Hitler and Franco as well. So true despots. And we should also remember that the joker as a card has a chaotic function in many games, because it's an outsider. The joker can bend the rules, it can suspend rules, it can be a trump card. That's just to say that the Joker is not a regular card, it's an outsider, but it's also a very powerful card. So I propose, therefore, that we read the Surrealist Joker as a commentary upon the tyrants of the time. The Joker expresses both the vulgarity and the obscenity of the performative power play of Fulgur Press. And it invites us to laugh at them, because that's one of the few tools that we have when faced with power. But it also points out that figures, men usually, like Ubu, do not feel that they need to play by the rules, and they can be very, very and acutely dangerous. And I think this warning runs very true today as well, at least for me. So in closing, I want to say that at least in wartime, the surrealists turned to making cards, tarot cards, but also these cards as oracular cards to play with, for instance, but also to use as a tool to imagine alternative realities, maybe other outcomes, better futures. And they certainly point towards the emancipatory, the liberating, the revolutionary effect that a surrealist attitude can have. And I think that can be very inspiring for us today as well. I would say it is always possible to revolutionize your mind, and I invite you all to do so. Thank you. And I would like to now give the stage to Felicity.
Thanks, Tessa. Hi everyone, it's wonderful to see you all here, and I echo Tessa's thanks to everyone sitting here in the front row. Just a truly wonderful book with so much care and attention to the scholarship within its pages as well. Please do take a look afterwards if you haven't already seen it. So I'm just going to speak briefly about two female surrealists, and what I find interesting about both of them is neither of them made a tarot deck. So we're looking, in the book you will see a number of surrealist artists who made their own deck, who interpreted the cards in very visual ways. And neither Penrose nor Varro did that, but they both used tarot in their work explicitly. And in terms of Penrose, tarot was part of her daily life. It was a very quotidian thing, almost like reading the newspaper. She would read and shuffle the cards. So I'm going to say a little bit about both of them. And also, something I'm very interested in is the ways in which the female surrealists have this syncretic approach to, let's say, alchemy, astrology, Eastern mysticism, tarot, mythology, any number of things that they bring together in really interesting ways. So I just want to see how tarot plays into that. And I'm going to start with Valentine Penrose on the left. So Penrose was born on the 1st of January. She's a Capricorn, she was a Capricorn, and astrology and tarot kind of really go together in her practice. She was born in France. Without going into her biography too much, her autobiography too much, she was married to the British surrealist Roland Penrose, and then went and did her own thing, travelled across the world and lived in an ashram in India for a long time, and is very, very interested in alternative belief systems and what Tessa was saying about revolutionary acts in the everyday. And a mode of divination was definitely the tarot. So in her desk drawer, when she died, she was living in Farley Farm in Sussex, and her archive has been set up in a beautiful way at the National Scottish Galleries in Edinburgh. And in her desk drawer were half of her major tarot cards. The rest of them are still at Farley's. And when I was in the archive, I really wondered where her desk was. And so I went to Farley's and asked Anthony Penrose. And it seems that this is her desk, which was brought over from France with the black star. The dream, the connection to dream is really important in her work, and she was often called the dark star of surrealism. So the black star, you can see at the top in this kind of bureau, and her tarot cards would have been in one of those drawers there. So they were ready to hand at any time when she was researching. And there are many anecdotes about her extraordinary powers of divination and prospecting, which in the end, Anthony Penrose certainly stopped asking her to read his tarot cards because it was getting too uncanny. So this is kind of the background. Very much tarot was part of her work. Okay. Her most famous work is Bloody Countess, which is a historical novel which she researched meticulously about Elizabeth Bathory. And what's interesting, again, in her approach to telling the history of the Countess and her terrible history is that she thinks about the Carpathian Mountains and the peasants and the various people living in the mountains and how they would exchange different belief systems. So this is at the top a quote from that book. Bohemians had brought the most ancient of sciences there to the mountains. Vampirism, occultism, alchemy, necromancy, tarot cards, and above all, ancient black magic. So we can see even in her interpretation how there's this syncretic approach to the idea of magic in a broad surrealist sense. This is just an example from one of her poems, where what is interesting is how stars, the moon, wheels often come into her poetry. The stars look down, riveted by the advance of matte black hooves. On the window panes, I wept stars. And there's this beautiful alchemical process that happens when she's thinking about women in her collage and in her poetry, where we see a kind of accumulation of ideas that come through the body. The idea of weeping stars, we might think of the famous star card in the Marseille deck, but certainly this idea that the boundaries between herself and the women that she writes about and these divinatory practices, whether that's, using a cauldron, using crystals or tarot, these all come into play. It's kind of tempting to talk about Penrose as a sorceress, like so many people of the time did. She was often referred to as a sorceress. In Man Ray's film La Garoupe, she is shown reading the palm of Mouche Eloire. So there's always the sense that she's being framed by the surrealists as this kind of sorceress, a practitioner of some kind of magic, and her accuracy later in life feeds into this. But I don't want to do that, to just say, she is a sorceress, she's a witch, she's a magic woman. Maybe, but she didn't really see herself as that. It was very ordinary to her. And what I do think is important is how she breaks down some of these boundaries in really incredible poetry. And this collage on the left is from a collage novel from 1951 called Don des Féminines, Gifts of the Feminine, in which two women travel the world and encounter many adverse conditions, and which they meet with various belief systems that are shown in the iconography. Here is another closer detail. The hanged perspective, the reverse figure, is something that also characterizes her work. And this also comes out in a poem that was published in 2001 as a collaboration. The poem was written by the poet Pierre Cauchemar, and this collage on the left, Pierre Rojansky made. And in it you can see the wheel featuring very prominently. And this poem is called La Voie Valentine, which is the path of Valentine. And Pochemar, in this poem, uses Valentine's allure as a spiritual surrealist, and he speaks of her as hanging upside down in the poem. So this idea of the hanged figure crops up time and time again. And yes, there's a sense that there's a lot of darkness in her work, trouble and real pain. She wasn't very well for a lot of the time in her life. But there's also the other reading of the hanged man as a positive one, a time of change and shift, which definitely, I think, the people who interpret her poems, like Paul Eluard as well, refer to. So I'm just going to leave Valentine with this quote from Anthony Penrose, who lived with her for many years when he was a child at Farley Farm. She had an arcane connection to the primordial element of female creativity. She understood the secrets of the stars, the ways of animals, and the intimate life of plants. Astrological charts were her street maps, and her tarot cards gave her insights into the future. The planes of place and time held no firm attachment for her. Okay. And just quickly, I just wanted to put Remedios here today. Again, she was not making her own deck, but she was very, very close to Carrington at this period in time, and Carrington was working on her own deck of cards. So rather than actually Victor Browner's influence, there's more of an influence in the friendship between Carrington and Varro at this point in time. And you can see Carta de Tarot here, which I haven't got time to go into the myriad interpretations that art historians have gone into, but I do want to note that this is a tiny, tiny card-like painting on hippopotamus bone. She made a lot of paintings on bone, but I think it's very significant that it's on hippopotamus bone. And the kind of Egyptian symbolism in the hippopotamus goddess of fertility. But here, you know, again, we've got the star, the five-pointed star, perhaps, you know, and we can see perhaps something of the giantess in the way this is drawn, I always think. I don't know. But other people have interpreted the snake as being not the star card or not even the magician or the juggler, but temperance, because there are two sprouting heads. So I don't want to lock this down into any particular interpretation, the point being that it means many things to different people and can go in many directions. And obviously, the reading around it being the magician card, the juggler, comes from this, from 1956, oil and inlaid mother of pearl. So again, the materials on which Varro is working. So I think it's interesting what she says here, thinking about this idea of syncretism. So it's not wholeheartedly buying into, you know, this means this. I am exclusively referring to tarot. There's a lot more to it. This is a conjurer. He's loaded with tricks and colour and life. He carries all sorts of animals and miraculous things in his caravan. Before him is the multitude. In order to be more of multitude, they even wear a common garment, an enormous piece of grey cloth with openings to put their heads through. They all look like one another. And here we have Hermit from a similar time period. And, you know, what's interesting, again, is she will not lock down the meaning. And if you look at this wonderful book of writings here that's being translated by Margaret Carson, you can see what she said about each of these paintings. What I find interesting, her famous painting, The Flute Player, which has famously an octagonal tower that was probably Rodney Collins' tower in Mexico, when Carrington and Varro were learning about the fourth way in a kind of very loose manner, let's say. But she says in relation to that painting, the tower is octagonal to symbolize, somewhat vaguely, I have to say, octaves. So this idea, somewhat vaguely, is just what I wanted to point out here. There are varying degrees of adherence to what the readings are, what the meanings are locked into, and a very playful attitude to mixing different systems to find something interesting to say about female experience. I think I'll leave it there.
Ah, it's me. Welcome, everyone. So, for the British artist Ethel Colquhoun, the tarot was not a surrealist motif or a vehicle for political commentary, nor was it a tool for fortune-telling or a card in a jester's cap. From the earliest days of her interest, circa 1928, then aged 22 and still studying at the Slade, Colquhoun saw the tarot as the embodiment of a complex set of occult ideas. These were not those published by Guillaume de Givray and other historians of the day, so popular with the surrealists, but the primary working documents of a secret English occult order. Under initiated instruction, Colquhoun believed that these ideas could provide the means for self-discovery, and even, perhaps, a sense of transcendence. Retaining fidelity to these traditional ideas within a contemporary context became a lifelong pursuit for the artist. This evening, I will outline the art practice that informed Colquhoun's exploration of the tarot, with her various versions of the Ace of Wands serving as examples. I will also note the card designs that likely influenced her and the way surrealist automatic processes provided the breakthrough she needed to create an entire pack of 78 cards, her tarot's colour. But first, I need to give you a little context. Although short-lived, Colquhoun's participation in the surrealist movement proved highly influential. In the summer of 1939, subsequent to her exhibition at the Mayer Gallery, Colquhoun was invited by the surrealist Gordon Onslow Ford to a chateau near Chemelou, France. There she met Roberto Matta, who had been then exploring an automatic technique he termed psychological morphology. This involved gestures and manipulations of paint poured and blended immiscibly on the canvas. His painting Inscape, which I've reproduced here, developed while at Chemelou, was Matta's first major work using this method. Vastly different from her experiences at the Slade, Colquhoun was inspired by these expressions of pure psychic automatism, and between 1940 and 43, we see her work undergo a creative and experimental surge. I include this photo because you can see Colquhoun's in a position of privilege between Matta and his wife. So during this period, Colquhoun was also friendly with the artist Frida Harris, then in partnership with the occultist Alistair Crowley to produce designs for a tarot titled The Book of Thoth. A key source for their project were the teachings of the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, a turn-of-the-century occult group of which Crowley was once a member. Colquhoun was fascinated with this group, and her interest dated back to her first experiments with tarot circa 1928. The group advocated students produce their own deck according to a specific iconography that was quite distinct from traditional tarot designs and reputedly encoded with hidden knowledge. One secret, descriptions of these images, known as Book T, were published in 1940 by Israel Regardie. In this sketch for the Ace of Wands, which is circa 1942, we can see Colquhoun follow these directions carefully. And curiously, there is a variant sketch for the Ace of Wands from around the same date. Here, Colquhoun departs from Book T's symbolism to reference the 1909 design by Pamela Coleman Smith. To the left, we see a castle. Below, a winding river. The floral elements she specifies in the left margin, columbine, toadflax, etc., are a variation in detail without provision of context. Here, too, the Golden Dawn underpinned her interest. When creating her designs, Coleman Smith was working with the occultist Arthur Edward Waite, who was a former member. So these two sketches date from the early 1940s and are the largest Colquhoun produced for her work with tarot, each nearly 75 by 57 centimetres. It is tempting, I think, to suggest such scale during the paper shortages of World War II underscores their importance for the artist. I might even propose that these sketches hold a searching quality, as if the artist is venturing to explore differing approaches perhaps with an intent to reconcile them. And yet, while these were the first and last figurative designs Colquhoun produced from this key source material, so in 1949, Colquhoun produced 4 squarish watercolours titled after the tarot aces. The format discredits the idea these were intended as designs for cards, and the inconsistency in style between them underscores their experimental nature. But these works do reveal Colquhoun was exploring the magical use of colour. Red corresponds to the element fire, which was attributed in the Golden Dawn documents to the suit of wands. I would note the same card by Frida Harris in the Book of Thoth, exhibited in 1942 and seen at that time by Colquhoun, shares many points of similarity: the colour palette, the barbed details, and the phallic central form. Colquhoun's referencing of Coleman Smith and Harris speaks to her respect for these pioneering female artists, but also to the inclusivity and thoroughness of her creative process. In tackling her subject, many avenues and approaches were reviewed. It is important to note Colquhoun did not employ the tarot for divination, which she considered decadent, nor was it a means to critique contemporary politics or culture, so often the targets for surrealist activities. Rather, her engagement followed long-established Golden Dawn teachings. Tarot is a tool for meditation and self-discovery. In 1967, Colquhoun made a meditative study of the major arcana, closely following Golden Dawn practices. These meditations open with a card name, a place, time, weather, lunar phase, and then a psychic description, followed by conventional contexts concerning the card within the wider study of tarot. Her favourite personal decks for comparative purposes are also cited in these notes: the Waite-Smith deck, not surprisingly, from 1909, the Paul Foster Case Builder at Dighton deck, 1929, the Major Arcana by Worth from 1926, and the Insight Institute deck, which is around 1948, and also a vintage French pack. Unfortunately, she only did the Major Arcana. It would have been fascinating if she'd done the whole tarot, but that's what we have. So in late 1976, now aged 70, Colquhoun learned that an American artist, Robert Wang, had been commissioned by Israel Regardie to produce a tarot deck in strict accordance with the Golden Dawn iconography. Corresponding with the artist, Colquhoun reflected on her own earlier difficulties with the awkward, symbol-laden imagery. The precise nature of her epiphany, and I think the word apposite, is lost to us, but it seems likely Colquhoun recognized the metaphors of Book T no longer served contemporary eyes in the culture of pop art. Writing to Regardie in February 1977, Colquhoun notes, "You may like to know I am engaged in my own personal tarot, but it is non-figurative and based on pure colour. Within a few months, Colquhoun would exhibit the tarot as colour." So here you can see Robert Wang's image and Colquhoun's version of it from almost 30 years earlier. This is Colquhoun's final design for the Ace of Wands. It was executed using Roberto Matta's psychological morphology process. Diluted enamels were dripped and poured onto a thick card, roughly 5 by 4 inches, with Colquhoun instinctively tilting and turning to aid flow. The gold ink was applied by hand. Despite the fact Colquhoun discarded the traditional figurative instructions of Book T, her design for tarot's colour remains loyal to Golden Dawn teachings. To ensure this, Colquhoun reconciled several key Golden Dawn sources to produce a symbolic colour hierarchy unique to this project. In this way, she was able to produce a tarot that provided the specificity of occult content through the hasard adjective of a fluid surrealist process. It is tempting to offer a comparator by a contemporary artist, or better yet, another surrealist. But as design for a tarot, Colquhoun's was without parallel in 1977 and remains so. Setting aside Colquhoun's fleeting membership of ELT Messon's London group, we might categorise this tarot as surrealist because it employs an automatic technique devised and developed by the surrealist movement. This is more than sufficient, I feel, but I will go further. In a sweeping discard of a figurative tradition that had dominated tarot for nearly 500 years, Eiffel brought to the essence of surrealism, its revolutionary energy, to an iconography both occulted and relatively static. To do so while retaining fidelity to both her sources and technique is a mark of her extraordinary vision as an artist. In a text that accompanied the first exhibition of the designs at the Newlyn Art Gallery, Colquhoun noted, "After I had completed the pack, I saw some slides showing nebula in outer space and the birth of stars. These repeated my designs and confirmed my conviction of their cosmographic function." Colquhoun never elucidates what she means by cosmographic function, but it reminds me of a famous passage in the Emerald Tablet that would have resonated with Breton. To paraphrase, "as above, so below." Thank you.
Okay, I don't want us to drown in gratitude, but I'd just like to echo the gracious thanks that have been shared. And from me, special thanks to Caroline, whose support allowed this event to happen this evening. So thanks very much, Caroline, and all the contributors, editors, everyone who's made this happen. Just briefly, some points of overlap with everything that's been discussed so far, and there are lots of them really. The paper that I'm about to give, brief paper, kind of snapshot paper, is about testing the limits of traditional iconography, tarot iconography, so resonances with what Tessel was speaking about, in relation to matters, innovations of traditional designs. This paper is also absolutely about this syncretic conception of magic that Felicity discussed. Camacho treats the tarot concurrently and kind of interchangeably with his explorations of alchemy and also heraldry. He's extremely interested in medieval heraldry. And then a connection with Robert's paper, in my last gasp, my last breath, I turned back to surrealist paradigms of automatism. So there are connections with all of the papers we've had so far. Okay. In the early 1970s, just over a decade after his entry into the French surrealist community, Camacho painted canvases named after certain cards from the tarot's major arcana. These works were ostensibly distinct from any kind of invocation of the tarot as cartomantic practice. This is a scenario that can be recognized in several of the chapters in Surrealism and the Tarot. Artists creating large format, wall-bound paintings based upon tarot designs, and is worth reflecting on more generally as a phenomenon. Why would people do this? So without excluding the possibility that the reinscription of specific designs might create images and objects of mandala-like potency as sites of personal orientation, affirmation, or catharsis, I approach Camacho's interest in the tarot as something slightly distinct from this tendency. Alongside his serious and prolonged explorations of alchemical and heraldic imagery, Camacho's treatment of the tarot seems to relate to his broader efforts to work through and beyond traditional occult iconography as a practical invocation of the lessons of change and transformation he found in these occult discourses. Camacho's paintings labelled Le Fou and Le Battleur are strange prospects as artistic responses to the tarot, in the sense that they are barely recognizable as the cards their titles designate. In the painting Le Fou, we encounter the titular terms contrariwise, such that they read fool, evoking either a crowd or the action of treading on something. The figure of the fool seems to appear as a mummy-headed mannequin to the right, whose fleshy torso teeters on legs bowed like a wishbone or tentacles. The fool may even appear again as the toady being striding into the scene on the left. The dog, traditionally depicted clawing at the fool's breeches, is just about recognizable in the wolf-headed apparition that is either unspooling from or recoiling into the tangled mass in the foreground. The fool's bindle, cast away, has morphed into a monstrous joint of meat. In Le Bateleur, the image's estrangement from its namesake is perhaps even more extreme, as the canvas depicts two deathly totems, one perhaps the shadow or diminishment of the other, impaled by a connecting shaft. The painting's very loosely cruciform layout, a vertical bisecting a horizontal, and displaying fanning shapes above, forms that register as heads, are its only tenuous visual correlations to the design of the magician in the standard setting Tarot de Marseille. Against the standard suite of tarot designs that had become firmly established by the 18th century, many artists have offered bold and ambitious reinventions, often involving wholesale supplantation of the tarot's iconographic specificity. Camacho does something slightly different here, to the extent that he does seize upon and work with the traditional iconography. By inscribing that iconography, then tempering it, melting it, withering it, injecting it, enriching it, and then finally holding it on a knife edge, in these works, Camacho fixes upon the threshold moment between an old form departing and a new one emerging, between a close and a beginning. The theoretical interest and the philosophical point here is that the destruction of one image is the creation of another, that deformation is also an act of formation, and dissolution also a space for coalescence. These ideas relating to the ebb and flow of transitional change are of course part of the core philosophical architecture of the tarot. Tellingly, which enacted such liminality explicitly, whose attributed significance and role was situated between one thing and another. The whole of the tarot has this aspect to it, of course, with every card's reading built around the possibility of upright and inverse interpretation and potentially oppositional significance. However, the cards that captured Camacho's imagination speak very directly to this theme of liminality, whose role can be understood as a kind of shape-shifting, and whose interpreted meaning was fugitive, fluid, and chameleon-like. The Fool famously can be read as either the beginning or ending of the major arcana sequence, positioned as either 0 or 22, representing either the newborn child, naive to the ways of the world, or the traveled and enlightened wanderer, leaving the plane of mundane experience for higher spiritual endeavors. The card is a changeling, by turns the opening and the close of the cycle. The figure of the magician, taken as an itinerant street performer with airs of the charlatan, can represent a trickster who trades in illusions of change. Treated more sympathetically or matter-of-factly as a figure who commands highly developed intellectual or magical powers, the magician can also more plainly represent the ability to transform life and the world, or, to put it another way, a figure who cannot accept stasis and is constantly compelled to test and alter their surroundings. In their changeable aspects, there are clear signs as to why these cards resonated with Camacho's efforts to articulate a molten or amoebic iconography. Another major arcana card critical to this theme of liminality and transition is the traditionally unnamed design, commonly known, which spells endings and beginnings and conflates the two. Ever since the tarot's probable 15th century origins, the figure of death in the 13th trump has typically been rendered as a scythe-wielding skeleton in an ambiguous action of harvest, simultaneously collecting crops from a field and dicing bodies onto the ground, in a scene that at once symbolizes life-giving sustenance and life-seizing violence. Contextualized within the narrative journey of the major arcana, death typically represents the liberation from old, misgiven, ego-bound consciousness and the stirring of a new existence from the fertile ground of the spiritual and unconscious substrata. As the few works already shown indicate, Camacho was consistently preoccupied with death as emblem, subject, and thematic texture of his painting. Indeed, dislocations, wounds, tears, and putrefaction are stock formal characteristics of what François-René Simon has dubbed the Camachian mass, which is often corpse-like. As if from the light of a waning moon, his whole oeuvre is lit by the 13th card of the major arcana. In 1976, a few years after his paintings Le Fou and Le Battleur, and in close proximity to his exploration of the tarot, Camacho put on the exhibition La Danse de la Mort at Galerie de Seine in Paris. The tarot figure of death hovers closely behind this project, which was effectively a response to the historic motif of the Dance of Death, or Danse Macabre, as a memento mori. The catalogue essay to the exhibition was written by the alchemy expert René Allot, who explains that Camacho's recourse to death does not relate to any kind of sensationalism, but has to do instead with death's broader philosophical resonance in ideas of change and transformation. Given his own background and Camacho's historical and long-standing interest in alchemy, it is towards Hermetic philosophy that Allot's analysis is drawn first and foremost. Yet the shadow of the tarot sits closely behind his reflections here. So this, Allot tells us, is the thematic territory of Camacho's art, the threshold at which death becomes birth and disintegration becomes generation. And on second hearing, as it rolls off the tongue, although maybe not mine, la danse de l'amour readily becomes la danse de l'amour. Death becomes love and the pathway to birth and life. This double sense of la danse de l'amour, rooted in the phrase's homophonic qualities, is not coincidental. Homonymic wordplay is absolutely essential to understanding Camacho's art and is to be found everywhere in his titles. Elsewhere in his work, this interest led him much further into other corners of occult discourse, towards alchemy, notably, and to heraldry, and the complex word-image interplay of heraldic crests and mottos. In 1974, the poet Joyce Mansour, in a poetic commentary on his recent painting, compared Camacho's works to hieroglyphs, working like anagrams and palindromes. At Mansour's suggestion, these linguistic operations are enticing analogies for the way in which Camacho's brushwork and line break down, test, and remold visual resemblances. Camacho's images distend, stray from, and ostensibly leave familiar iconographical forms, but in operations comparable to an auditory sleight of hand of homophones, anagrams, and palindromes, they also leave fragments of that form which can be gathered and put back together to reform the original like a spectre, even in its apparent absence. In all his painting, following his immersion in the French surrealist community, Camacho internalized lessons of liminality and change learned through a suite of occult traditions, of which the tarot was one. In his lifelong efforts to test the status, limits, and malleability of iconography from discourses such as the tarot, alchemy, and heraldry, he consistently operated within and without of these traditions, by plunging us into a chthonic, chaotic domain of liquid, gelatinous, unbounded forms and beings that could either be nascent or decaying versions of their traditional iconographical counterparts. Jacques Dupin's comments on the aqueous, mercurial development of Camacho's images capture this elemental quality of form in his paintings perhaps better than any. In tantalizing ways, his remarks also reconnect Camacho's art notionally with surrealist principles of automatism and chance-based creative practices. To complete the circle then, these observations seem to open onto another way of thinking about Camacho's practice, which would recognize how these philosophies of change were channeled into the process and experience of painting itself as an amorphous, revelatory adventure, such that painting, never simply illustrative, was itself found to be a divinatory act. And that's me, so thank you.
Hi, everyone. We have, let's say, 15 to 20 minutes for questions, and I do want to give you all the opportunity for that. Can I ask you, at least for the first 10 minutes, to ask a question? I'm sure many people also have comments, but maybe we can save the comments for the drinks reception and start with some questions first. But before we do that, I'm going to make use of the fact that I have the microphone here to first pose a question to our panel. Thank you so much. It's been a joy to work with the three of you and now also to hear these papers. But the question that I have is, it's a zeitgeist question. Why this, why now? Why is tarot so on trend in fashion at the moment? And why is it such a happy marriage as well between surrealism and tarot? I'll pose this to all of you as well, but first, our panel. Yeah, please.
Sorry. So, some of you may know that a few years ago I published the Tarot of Leonora Carrington. It was 2020, and the world was sort of convulsed with COVID. And it went absolutely viral, that tarot. Far exceeded the expectations of the American distributor. And the feedback that I got at that time, and we had, Italian Vogue was contacting us, The Guardian, it was just a full kind of global press interest. I think was a sense of tremendous uncertainty in the world generated by COVID. And I think people were looking for ways in which they could manage that sense of, the unexpected. So I would say that sort of feeds into it certainly, and I think surrealism being on point and centenary is also playing into that.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah.
I mean, Robert will have greater insights into this than me as a publisher, in that you've got kind of tangible insights into these trends and popularity of certain publications and tarot decks, as you say. I mean, I've spoken to people about this. I think I've chatted to you about it at points, Tessel. I've spoken to Nadia in the audience about this. And I'm not really sure if I can put my finger on specific contextual reasons, but there's definitely been a kind of sea change and paradigm shift around all of this, in that when I started my PhD in 2013, I thought I was on a single track road to complete obscurity and oblivion, and then somehow by the time of completing it, there's a real energy around this as a kind of facet of research, but beyond that, it's something in public consciousness and popular culture as well. So, that's just me saying I've observed this. I still don't have any keen handle on the reasons why. But Felicity might have some other thoughts.
Yeah.
No, just building on what you've both said. I think there is something quite cyclical in where we find ourselves politically right now, and in times of turbulence, in particular, where you look for answers, for direction. I think there's something also very soulless in the online presence of the self, and the idea that the tarot, I think Hodorowski has a brilliant video where he talks about his interpretation of tarot, and the idea of mirroring the self in the cards, I think is quite magical, and provides another avenue to think about the self amidst everything else. I don't know.
Yeah. No, I agree with that. Yeah. Thank you. And I think also, just to come back to what you were saying, Will, I remember doing my PhD on surrealism and the occult a long time ago, and then speaking about it, and then sometimes I sort of, people would expect me to, say a magic spell and then change into another animal or something. It was just, and it's not that long, I'm not that old, it's not that long ago, but there was a time, certainly in academia, where this was a sort of a weird topic. and maybe not so taken serious, or you know, there was sort of these expectations about what I was doing in my private life, and I think that has sort of really changed. There's sort of the popularity and the wider acceptance of alternative spiritualities, alternative systems of meaning. It's not something that you only talk about with people that you know are also into it, but it's much more sort of a topic of discussion, I would say, certainly among my students. So there's also just a wider interest. And I'm sure many of you share that interest, so I'm going to move to the room. Any questions? And please stand up or raise your hand and the microphone will come to you.
Thank you. I just wanted to say that was an incredible, fantastic talk. I'm so glad that you put this together. I wanted to ask about the cards that they made when they were in Marseille. They made the deck of cards.
Yes.
Why do you think that they made a deck of cards rather than a tarot deck?
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you for that question. That was all stuff that I had to cut out of what I wanted to say. So they were in Marseille, and Marseille is, of course, the center of card making. The traditional French tarot cards are called the Tarot de Marseille, and it's actually a family of design made in Marseille because Marseille was the center of printing in France. And cards, when cards came to Europe, to France, they were woodblock printed, and that was usually done in Marseille. So most of the cards were, at one point or other, printed in Marseille. The surrealists were there. Breton went to the archive and researched cards. Point one. Point two, in the 20s and 30s, the surrealists were playing predictive games with cards. So not with tarot cards, but it was very, well, I wouldn't say common, but it wasn't uncommon for them to play or to take or seriously try to predict the future with regular playing cards. And thirdly, Breton made this connection between cards, so playing cards, and political change. And the question is, do the cards change after a political revolution, or do the cards actually make that revolution happen? So for instance, there used to be a time where the ace as the one was the lowest valuing card, but after the French Revolution, it became, as an ace, it became an important trump card, because with the French Revolution now, the person who is a one can also be as important as the king and queen, as it were. So I think maybe by sort of bringing down the Ancien Regime and making the court cards and also making the four suits, these four surrealist fundamental premises, they were trying to affect a change politically as well. Because yeah, you never know what powers cards may hold, be they playing cards or tarot cards. Thank you for the question. Anything any of you would like to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, you'll probably know more about it than I do, Tessa, but I'd also wondered if it was just circumstance and if actually the discussions only got so far because it was this kind of transient space while they're gathered in Marseille and people are leaving and arriving under strange circumstances.
But also, what do you do when you're waiting somewhere and you're stuck, or you're traveling, or you're on a ship?
Yeah,
you play cards. Cards travel really well. So I think playing cards are also associated with the transience in that sense. And it's also something you can easily take with you even and hide. Let's say you're running or you're hiding, but a pack of cards is still something you can carry on your body. Other questions? There's one in the front.
Good evening and thank you. Is there a distinction between some of the artists? They seem to have made complete decks which were very which were geared towards being used as a deck of tarot, whereas other artists may have geared their work more towards being an expression of what they were feeling, of their art and so forth, without the intention of them being a full deck of cards that would have been used. Is there any sort of distinction between these two different streams, and do they sort of sense? If you like. It's an interesting question, isn't it? I think Tessel touched on this point in her opening, actually. The sense that originally, the cards were intended as fortune telling in the early mid part of the 20th century, and then from the 1960s onwards, they become more about self-awareness and self-development. And I think what we're looking at there is we're looking at a kind of a greater dispersal of what was intended. If you look at the Golden Dawn, for example, as I was talking about, the tarot cards were always intended for personal development, never for divination. And that sort of sentiment, if you like, became more and more widespread as we go into the occult revival, so-called, from 1960s and 70s. Their papers became published and became more commonly available. I think that we saw that sort of shift. But in terms of the actual artists and what their intent was, I mean, Colquhoun certainly never intended them to be used for divination. Mm-hmm. And in fact, it's a point, they were designs, they're not cards. They weren't actually a pack produced. The panels, right? Yeah, they're just the panels. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, it's interesting with the Carrington Major Arcana, which is a similar thing. I mean, they're quite small, quite intense. When I first saw those, my initial instinct was that this was a sort of a reference for her, a meditative reference, and that she never really intended them to be made into a pack. It's a sort of almost like a datum, if you like, for the kind of energies of the cards. And I think for Colquhoun it was sort of similar in a way.
Because she never actually had a deck of cards made in her lifetime. I think that was done later, wasn't it?
Guilty as charged, yes.
Perhaps I can fold that question back to Robert or Tessel. I'd be interested to know proportionately how many complete decks we're dealing with in the volume. Out of the 18 chapters, how many?
So I would say many surrealists designed or made designs for cards or card-like designs, or like the one you showed by Varo, which is very tiny and it's called the tarot card, but it's not one particular one. Or what you showed, Will, so they're not cards, they're paintings, but there's a clear resonance there. But let's say the surrealists, or those associated with surrealism, who designed a set, and there's a few who've done a major arcana, which is already quite a lot of designs that you want to make, and there's very few who've done the full 78. So I thought Colquhoun is one who has done the full 78, but that 78 works of art, it's just a lot of work. So I think those who did a full set, be it as artworks or even as cards, that's very few. Many more surrealists either responded to it or made designs that we can read as tarot cards or as in discussion with tarot cards. And then there's a bigger group even of surrealists, like Valentine Penrose, for whom it's part of their life, or also perhaps also of literary work. I just, in preparation for today, I just browsed through the book and just listed all of the ways that tarot comes back in surrealism, if you'll bear with me for a minute. It's as a divination tool, as an oracular guide, as a prophetic device, as a poetic trope, an epistemic object, a means of inspiration, an instrument in a journey of self-transformation, an aesthetic object, and just an interesting artifact. And I think it's even more than this, but it has all of these different functions. Felicity, anything you want to add about Valentine's practice? Because I think she's in it being so central to her life and work.
Yeah, I mean, she's really interesting because she did a lot of birth charts as well. Her birth chart of Max Ernst is in the Breton archive, for example. She hated doing Guillaume Apollinaire. She didn't like him and said it caused her a lot of trouble. But if you look at her manuscripts for making those, they're really, really detailed. I think the tarot was much more, she used it as divination.
Yeah.
For the people around her, it brought her closer to them. And, she she had many relationships in her life, but she was quite a solitary person. So it was a means of getting people to come to her and include her. So I would say the tarot was it was like a fleet language for her. It was close at hand. Whereas astrology was much more the detailed, I'm going to make these really, really careful, researched, kind of 7-page lists of everything, which is very different from the tarot practice.
Yeah.
But she also uses it in her poetry a lot, the iconography.
Yeah, and I think that also demonstrates that surrealism is not a style, but surrealism is a lifestyle. And I think also it's not like there was one way only in which you could engage with tarot. This is a collection of individuals over 100 years, even more, who engage with something that is also a cultural product. And for some of them might have been quite new, but for others maybe part of already their youth or maybe their background. And they engage it in very particular ways, which for me also really illustrates the richness of surrealism, and that this one thing takes on so many different shapes and meanings in the movement. I would add also there's also an element of entertainment value and shock value. And there's also, engaging in tarot also has, it can create a certain response in your audience. And one anecdote that I want to share is Salvador Dalí was a very avid tarot reader, and I think really good at it as well. And she read very often for Salvador Dalí. And he always said that he took it very seriously, but the one thing with Salvador Dalí is that you cannot believe anything that man has ever said about himself. But at one stage, this was later on, he was in negotiations about a big project for making a lot of art, and he was getting a lot of money for it. And then he couldn't decide, and he went out of the room to have his cards read by Gala, and he made everybody wait while his cards were being read, and then he came back and he said, the cards spoke, and I'm going to do this deal, and please give me all this money. So there's also sort of a performative aspect to working with tarot cards, independent of the fact how serious maybe Gala herself might have been in her practice. If it's all right with you, Caroline, 1 or 2 more questions? Okay. Yeah. Oh, yeah, go ahead.
I've got a specific question for Robert, but just to add a couple of other elements into the question about zeitgeist. In a very screen-based and mediated world that we're in, I think tarot is also very haptic.
Yeah.
It's very physical. It promotes often, not always, but often an encounter, a quite special encounter between 2 people, or more people, but certainly in space. There are tarot bots, there's online tarot activity, but I think tarot really specifies itself by anchoring itself in a reality. Physical cards are handleable and people love holding things, and so I think that's quite a strong counterpoint to our digitalized mediated culture. Secondly, it's a bit more prosaic, which is just the sheer amount of tarot cards in culture is a product of, I think, certainly since the turn of the last century, just the ease of their production.
Yeah.
Because of desktop publishing and printing technology, it's much easier to make physical cards, and that's not just contemporary decks, and lots of artists are making decks, I think, as a result of that, but it also means lots of historical decks are coming into culture because they're being reproduced, so they're being reflected on and written about, and again, historians having the cards in their hands rather than just looking at them as reproductions, and the deck gives a completely different way of analysing material. So Robert, I just wonder whether you could speculate on the scale of those 2 I thought Colquhoun drawings that you talked about. I think you said they were 70 by 50?
75 by 57.
That's really quite large, and and especially when they're just drawings, sometimes you see artists making drawings in preparation for kind of mural-like objects or commissions or something. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, I can bookend that, actually, yeah. And Yeah, so she produced wall hangings for the slave school dogs, which were tarot designs. I think it's the Juggler and the Fool, and they were vast. And the Tate now has both the preparatory sketches and the actual fabric hangings. So she was certainly familiar with taking the iconography of tarot into a different sphere. I should say those are very early, before she had, perhaps might say, an initiated viewpoint of it. But I think also when she was looking at the prospect of actually creating a full deck, when she was looking at, this is at sort of 1942, after she'd attended the opening of Frida Harris's exhibition, one of the challenges she thought was most pressing was the fact that the Golden Dawn iconography is hideously complex. And if you're a figurative artist and you want to give it your best shot, the best option you have is to make them at scale so that you've got space to actually render them. And I think that that's probably the way she was thinking of it, to give it space to sort of see how it actually worked. And as well, you probably may know, that that was one of the reasons she gave to Israel Regardie in the early 1970s as to why she didn't do it. She said you need the skill of a miniaturist in order to be able to do it properly. I think it's quite interesting they're so large during sort of 1942, and paper must have been extremely difficult to get hold of. But it's a great question, thank you.
Can I just add something to that about dimensions? What are the dimensions of the Frida Harris originals? Do you know that by any chance? Just in comparison.
They're considerably smaller.
Okay.
Yeah, I can't remember the precise. Yeah.
Thank you.
Could I just put a comment? It's just a comment about the popularisation of tarot and the occult and so on. Is the panel aware that a few years ago Netflix produced a show called Transatlantic?
Yeah.
It was all about the surrealists in Marseille.
Yeah.
I mean, I was just blown away. I couldn't believe it. It's like such an esoteric topic, and it's on a big, massive corporate American network. So, I mean, where can it go after that? That's all I want to say.
Thank you. There was a question just in the back for,
Okay. I was just wondering, because the subtitle of the book is a love story, so it's obviously focusing on the compatibility between surrealism and the tarot. But I was curious about whether we know of any instances of tension, like debates or disagreements around the purpose of creating tarot cards, or equally the origins and sources, because they were so varied.
Yeah, great question. Thank you.
Good question.
Yeah, I have a few things to say about that, but I'll look at the panel first.
I think I'll defer to you on this one, Tessa. You've done the framing work and the overview, so yeah.
Well, one anecdote I can share is that so Jodorowsky was at a young age introduced to tarot cards, and he was really he totally fell in love with it. And then he had a Smith Wade deck. He came to Paris, he met Breton. The deck was really personally important to him, and he showed it to Breton, and Breton was very, very dismissive. So within, let's say, Bretonian surrealism, it's only cards in the French tradition, preferably the Marseille tradition, but for instance also cards in the tradition of Papus or Oswald Weird. These are all French design traditions, because he felt that the British tradition, in particular the symbolist cards of Pamela Coleman Smith, were too symbolically overburdened, as it were. There were too many symbols crammed in there. The iconography was just too much. It was too much on the nose. So this is just one example of, I think, snobism about particular kinds of cards. And there are several other instances of that. Robert, anything you would like to add?
I'm not sure there is, actually.
I think also, can I just emphasize that this is, so we have all presented artists and their cards, and we've been able to fill an entire book with information about this, and I think we could do a second book even. But also, this is a movement that has existed for a century, all over the globe. So there are entire parts of surrealism, surrealist artists, surrealist groups who are really not engaging at all with tarot cards. There's very little interest. There's a lot of interest in games and game playing, so maybe cards and dice in that sense, but not tarot cards specifically. So although we think this is a very important theme, please don't get the impression that this is sort of one of the major themes in surrealism. I think it was a theme, but there were many, many more. I think also, I see a few more questions, but I think, can I ask you to save those questions for the drink reception? All four of us will be there, so you can ask us our questions as well. Thank you all so much for being here, for your presence, for sharing your energy. And let me also thank these three wonderful colleagues. It's been such a joy. Thank you, everyone.